Picture a quaint English village, St. Mary Mead, where a glamorous socialite, Beatrice Ashford, lies dead, poisoned by her own exquisite perfume, Fleur Morte. In this gripping Agatha Christie-style mystery, Miss Jane Marple unravels a web of envy, secrets, and betrayal. A cunning perfumer, a resentful assistant, a jealous rival, and a mysterious friend. All had reasons to kill. But who laced the perfume stopper with deadly arsenic? With sharp wit and quiet wisdom, Miss Marple peels back the layers of deception to reveal a chilling truth in just 12 suspenseful chapters. Dive into the poisoned perfume bottle, where beauty hides a deadly scent. Chapter 1. The Scent of Death. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's cottage in St. Mary Mead, casting delicate patterns on the polished oak floor. She sat by the window, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically, a soft skein of pale blue wool unspooling in her lap. The village was awake, its usual hum of activity. Mrs. Price's bakery van trundling down the lane, the postman's bicycle bell jingling, comfortingly familiar. Yet, as Miss Marple's keen eyes scanned the street, she sensed a discord, a faint ripple in the village's tranquil surface. It began with a scream, sharp and piercing, slicing through the autumn air from the direction of Lavender Cottage. Miss Marple's needles paused mid-stitch. She tilted her head, her silver hair catching the light, and listened. Moments later, the clatter of running feet and a babble of voices confirmed her instinct. Something was amiss. She set her knitting aside, adjusted her spectacles, and stepped to the door just as young Tommy Pierce, the butcher's boy, panted up the path. "Miss Marple, ma'am," he gasped, his freckled face flushed. "It's Lady Ashford. Dead, they say, at Lavender Cottage. Dr. Haydock's been called." Miss Marple's expression remained serene, but her eyes sharpened. "Dead, you say? How dreadful, and so sudden. Tell me, Tommy, what have you heard?" Tommy, eager to share, spilled the village's nascent gossip. Lady Beatrice Ashford, the glamorous socialite who had taken up residence in Lavender Cottage 6 months prior, had collapsed that morning. She was found by her maid, Ellen, sprawled across her dressing-room floor, her silk robe askew, a crystal perfume bottle clutched in her hand. The scent of Fleur Morte, her newest acquisition, still lingered in the air. "They're saying it's poison, ma'am," Tommy whispered, eyes wide. Something in that perfume she was always wearing. Miss Marple nodded, dismissing Tommy with a kind word and a shilling for his trouble. She returned to her chair, her mind already sifting through the fragments of this tragedy. Beatrice Ashford, at 32, had been a vision of elegance, her auburn hair and emerald eyes the talk of St. Mary Mead. Her arrival, with her London airs and dazzling wardrobe, had stirred both admiration and envy among the villagers. Miss Marple, ever observant, had noted Beatrice's charm at the vicarage tea, her laughter bright but her eyes watchful, as if guarding a secret. By noon, the village was abuzz. Miss Marple, strolling to the post office under the pretense of mailing a letter, gathered more details. Mrs. Bantry, bustling out of the shop with a parcel, was only too eager to share. "It's quite shocking, Jane," she said, her voice low with excitement. "Dr. Haydock says it's arsenic, absorbed through the skin, if you can believe it. That perfume, Fleur Morte, it's called. French, of course, and wildly expensive. Beatrice was mad for it, wore it everywhere." Miss Marple murmured sympathetically, her mind cataloging the facts. Arsenic, a poison both subtle and cruel, suggested intent. The perfume bottle, an exquisite piece of craftsmanship with its faceted crystal and golden stopper, was no mere accessory. It was now a vessel of death. She recalled seeing Beatrice at the church fete, dabbing the scent on her wrists, her smile radiant as she captivated the crowd. Who, Miss Marple wondered, had reason to turn such beauty to ruin? As she passed Lavender Cottage, its lavender hedges neatly trimmed, she noted the crowd of curious villagers kept at bay by Constable Reed. The cottage, with its whitewashed walls and climbing roses, seemed an unlikely stage for murder. Yet murder, Miss Marple knew, thrived in the most unexpected corners. She paused, her eyes lingering on the upstairs window, where Beatrice's dressing room lay. A curtain twitched, and Ellen's pale face appeared briefly before vanishing. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple poured herself a cup of tea and settled by the fire. Her nephew, Raymond, a writer with a flair for the dramatic, would call this a delicious mystery. But to Miss Marple, it was a puzzle of human nature. Beatrice Ashford had enemies, perhaps not in the open but in the shadows. Envy, greed, or betrayal could all wear a smiling face. The perfume, she mused, was the key. Its creation, its delivery, its very essence held the truth. As the church clock struck 3, Inspector Craddock's car rolled into the village. Miss Marple, watching from her window, noted his brisk step and serious demeanor. He would be thorough, methodical, but he might miss the subtleties, the glance, the gesture, the unspoken grudge. She sipped her tea, her mind already weaving a tapestry of possibilities. The scent of death had settled over St. Mary Mead, and Miss Marple, with her quiet wisdom, was ready to unravel its secrets. Chapter 2. The Players in the Drama. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across St. Mary Mead's cobbled lanes, bathing the village in a golden haze that belied the chill of tragedy. Miss Jane Marple, seated at her rosewood writing desk, peered over her spectacles at a neatly folded copy of The Saint. Mary Mead Gazette. The headline, though restrained, spoke volumes. Tragic Death of Lady, Ashford at Lavender Cottage. She smoothed the paper, her fingers lingering on the grainy photograph of Beatrice Ashford, radiant in a fur-trimmed gown, her smile as enigmatic as ever. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. The village, she knew, was a stage, and its players were now assembling for a drama far darker than any parish theatrical. By tea-time, Inspector Craddock had established his headquarters at the Blue Boar Inn, its oak-paneled parlor commandeered for interviews. Miss Marple, invited by Mrs. Bantry for an impromptu gathering at the vicarage, found herself ideally placed to observe the unfolding case. The vicarage drawing-room, with its chintz curtains and well-worn armchairs, hummed with subdued chatter. Mrs. Bantry, her cheeks flushed from the excitement of gossip, poured tea with a vigor that rattled the cups. "Jane," she whispered, leaning close, "it's positively dreadful. Poison in a perfume bottle. Who could dream of such a thing?" Miss Marple inclined her head, her eyes drifting to the window where the vicarage garden lay serene under the fading light. "People," she said softly, "are capable of dreaming up all manner of things, Dolly, especially when envy or ambition takes hold." Her tone was mild, but her mind was already sifting through the village's whispers, piecing together the cast of this grim play. Inspector Craddock, a man of methodical habit and quiet competence, had outlined 4 suspects by the time Miss Marple arrived at the vicarage. Each had been seen with Beatrice Ashford in the days before her death, and each, in their way, had reason to wish her ill. Miss Marple, sipping her tea, listened as Mrs. Bantry relayed the inspector's findings, gleaned from her husband's brief encounter with Craddock at the inn. The suspects were Marcel Dubois, the perfumer who had crafted Fleur Morte; Clara Wren, Beatrice's assistant, whose loyalty seemed strained; Sylvia Vane, a rival socialite whose star had waned; and Evelyn Holt, a friend whose recent return had stirred old tensions. Miss Marple's needles, tucked in her knitting bag, remained still, but her thoughts clicked as steadily as they might. Marcel Dubois was the first to draw her attention. A Frenchman of middle years, he had arrived in St. Mary Mead 2 years prior, opening a perfumery that catered to the county's elite. His shop, Perfume d'Étoile, was a haven of polished glass and velvet drapes, its air heavy with the scents of rose, amber, and exotic spices. Dubois, with his waxed mustache and impeccable suits, had charmed the local gentry, but Miss Marple had noted his guarded manner at the church bazaar. He spoke of his art with passion, yet his eyes darted, as if watching for an unseen threat. Beatrice, it was said, had commissioned Fleur Morte as her signature scent, a creation Dubois boasted was unmatched. Had pride, Miss Marple wondered, or something darker, led to betrayal? Clara Wren, by contrast, was a figure of quiet obscurity. The assistant to Beatrice, she was a slight woman in her late 20s, her brown hair pinned tightly, her gray eyes downcast. At Lavender Cottage, she had managed Beatrice's correspondence, wardrobe, and social engagements, her presence barely noticed by the socialites' glittering circle. Yet Miss Marple, who had seen Clara at the post office fumbling with a parcel, had observed her nervous gestures and the faint tremor in her voice when addressed. Clara's devotion to Beatrice was evident, but so was her exhaustion. Mrs. Bantry, ever indiscreet, mentioned Clara's meager wages and Beatrice's sharp tongue. "Poor thing," Mrs. Bantry said. "Beatrice treated her like a doormat." I wouldn't be surprised if Clara snapped. Sylvia Vane, the third suspect, was a name that sparked murmurs across the village. A socialite of Beatrice's ilk, Sylvia had once reigned supreme in London's drawing rooms, her blonde beauty and biting wit the toast of the season. But Beatrice's arrival in St. Mary Mead had eclipsed her. At the recent charity gala held at Sylvia's manor, Beatrice had stolen the spotlight, her Fleur Morte scent trailing her like a siren's call. Sylvia's smiles, witnesses noted, had been brittle, her laughter forced. Miss Marple, who had attended the gala as a guest of the vicar, recalled Sylvia's sharp glance when Beatrice danced with Lord Harrowby, a wealthy widower Sylvia had long pursued. Envy, Miss Marple knew, could curdle into something far more dangerous. Evelyn Holt, the final player, was a puzzle. A childhood friend of Beatrice, she had returned from Paris only a month ago, her elegant manners and tailored dresses marking her as a woman of means. Yet her reunion with Beatrice at a dinner at Lavender Cottage had been strained, according to Ellen, the maid. Evelyn's years abroad had been spent studying chemistry, a fact that intrigued Miss Marple when she overheard it at the village shop. Chemistry, after all, was a science of transformations, some benign, some deadly. Evelyn's calm demeanor, her soft voice, belied a restlessness Miss Marple had glimpsed in her eyes. Old friendships, she reflected, could harbor old wounds. As the vicarage tea progressed, Miss Marple listened to the villagers' speculations, her mind weaving their fragments into a tapestry. Mrs. Price, the baker's wife, spoke of Dubois's late-night visitors at his shop, their faces hidden. Mr. Clements, the postmaster, mentioned Clara's recent agitation, her letters to London sent with urgency. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Harmon, whispered of Sylvia's temper, flaring when Beatrice's name was mentioned. And young Tommy Pierce, delivering scones, reported Evelyn's solitary walks near Lavender Cottage, her expression unreadable. Miss Marple, her tea cooling, noted each detail, her thoughts as precise as the stitches in her knitting. She rose, excusing herself to stroll the vicarage garden, where chrysanthemums bloomed in orderly rows. The suspects, she mused, were like notes in a perfume, each distinct yet blending into a complex whole. Dubois's pride in his craft could mask greed or fear of exposure. Clara's servitude might hide a deeper resentment, nurtured by years of slights. Sylvia's rivalry, fueled by lost status, could drive her to desperate acts. And Evelyn's quiet return might conceal a grudge, its roots buried in the past. Motives, Miss Marple knew, were like scents. They lingered, subtle but persistent, until revealed by the right moment. She paused by a lavender bush, its fragrance faint but evocative. Beatrice's death, she suspected, was no accident. The arsenic, absorbed through the skin, suggested a mind both cunning and patient. The perfume bottle, with its intricate design, was a perfect vehicle. Elegant, intimate, unsuspected. Whoever had poisoned it knew Beatrice's habits, her vanity, her love for Fleur Morte. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. The village, with its quiet lanes and tidy cottages, held secrets as deep as any city's underbelly. Returning to the vicarage, she found Inspector Craddock arriving, his face weary but determined. He greeted her with a nod, accustomed to her unobtrusive presence at such gatherings. "Miss Marple," he said, "I suppose you've heard the talk. A nasty business, this. Arsenic in a perfume bottle. Never seen anything like it." "Nor I," Miss Marple replied, her voice gentle. "But people, Inspector, are much the same everywhere. They love, they hate, they covet, and sometimes they kill." She smiled faintly, her eyes bright with understanding. Craddock, used to her cryptic wisdom, merely nodded, but she saw the flicker of respect in his gaze. As the vicarage emptied, Miss Marple lingered, her thoughts on the suspects. She pictured Dubois in his shop, blending essences with an artist's care, yet perhaps concealing a darker intent. Clara, scurrying through Lavender Cottage, her loyalty stretched thin by Beatrice's demands. Sylvia, glittering at her gala, her heart burning with envy. Evelyn, poised and distant, her past with Beatrice a shadow yet to be illuminated. Each, Miss Marple knew, had a story, and stories, like perfumes, had layers, top notes of charm, heart notes of ambition, base notes of truth. She stepped into the evening air, the village settling into dusk. The church clock chimed 6, its toll solemn. Miss Marple adjusted her shawl, her mind alert. The players were in place, the stage set. Somewhere in St. Mary Mead, a murderer hid behind a mask of civility. She would watch, she would listen, and, in time, she would uncover the truth. For now, she returned to her cottage, where her knitting awaited, its steady rhythm a counterpoint to the chaos of human hearts. Chapter 3. The Perfumer's Pride. The morning mist clung to the cobblestones of St. Mary Mead, softening the outlines of its cottages and lending an air of secrecy to the village. Miss Jane Marple, wrapped in a woolen shawl, walked briskly toward the high street. Her excuse, a bottle of lavender water she intended to purchase from Marcel Dubois' perfumery, Parfum d'Étoile. In truth, her errand was to observe the man whose creation, Fleur Morte, had become the instrument of Beatrice Ashford's demise. Her steps were light but purposeful, her eyes sharp beneath the brim of her sensible hat. People, she reflected, often revealed themselves in their own domains, where they felt most secure. Parfum d'Étoile stood at the corner of the high street, its bow window gleaming with bottles that caught the light like jewels. A bell tinkled as Miss Marple entered, and the air enveloped her in a heady blend of jasmine, sandalwood, and something sharper, bergamot, perhaps. Behind the counter, Marcel Dubois looked up from a ledger, his wiry frame stiffening momentarily before he summoned a smile. His mustache, meticulously waxed, twitched as he greeted her. "Mademoiselle Marple," he said, his French accent polished but not overdone. "A pleasure. You seek a fragrance today?" Miss Marple returned his smile, her demeanor that of a slightly fussy spinster. "Oh, just a small bottle of lavender water, Monsieur Dubois. Something simple for my linen cupboard. Though," she added, her tone guileless, "I've heard such talk of your talents. Lady Ashford's perfume, for instance. So tragic. What happened?" Dubois' smile faltered, his dark eyes flickering. "A tragedy, yes," he said, turning to fetch a bottle from a shelf. "Fleur Morte was my finest work, created for her alone. To think it was misused." His voice carried a note of indignation, but his hands, adjusting the bottle's label, trembled slightly. Miss Marple tilted her head, as if merely curious. "Misused? Such a curious word. Surely you mean tampered with. The police say it was arsenic, you know." She watched him closely, noting the tightening of his jaw. "Tampered, of course," Dubois corrected hastily, placing the lavender water before her. "I meant only that my art was defiled. I crafted Fleur Morte with care, rose absolute, neroli, a hint of civet. No poison could come from my hands." His tone was fervent, almost theatrical, but Miss Marple caught the defensive edge beneath it. She lingered, pretending to examine a display of crystal flacons. The shop was immaculate, its shelves lined with vials and stoppered bottles, each labeled in Dubois' precise script. A glass cabinet held rarer ingredients, ambergris, oud, and, she noted with interest, a small bottle marked arsenic solution. She stepped closer, her fingers brushing the cabinet's edge. "How fascinating," she murmured. "You use such unusual ingredients." Dubois followed her gaze, his expression tightening. "Arsenic, in minute traces, stabilizes certain essences," he said quickly. "It is common in perfumery, though not for Fleur Morte. That bottle, I fear, is missing, stolen, perhaps." He spread his hands, a gesture of helplessness, but his eyes avoided hers. Miss Marple nodded, as if satisfied, but her mind catalogued the detail. A missing vial, unaccounted for, was a convenient excuse. She paid for her lavender water, thanking Dubois with her usual courtesy, and stepped back into the street. The mist had lifted, revealing the village in crisp clarity, but her thoughts were clouded with questions. Dubois's pride in his craft was evident, but pride, she knew, could mask other sins, greed, fear, or even guilt. By noon, she was seated at Mrs. Price's tea room, a modest establishment where the village's gossip flowed as freely as the tea. Mrs. Price, bustling with a tray of scones, leaned close. "They're saying Dubois was at Lavender Cottage the day before Lady Ashford died," she whispered. "Delivered the perfume himself, he did. Odd, don't you think, for a man so busy?" Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression bland. "Perhaps he wished to ensure its safe arrival," she said, but her mind turned over the implication. Dubois's visit placed him at the scene, close to the bottle that would kill Beatrice. Had he delivered more than perfume? She recalled his nervous hands, his quick defense of his art. Men like Dubois, she mused, built their lives on reputation. A scandal, a flaw in their work, could ruin them. Had Beatrice threatened such a ruin? Inspector Craddock's arrival at the tea-room interrupted her thoughts. He joined her table, his notebook tucked under his arm. "Miss Marple," he said, his tone half amused, half resigned. "I might have known you'd be here, sniffing out the village's secrets." "Merely enjoying a scone," she replied, her eyes twinkling. "Though I did visit Monsieur Dubois this morning. Such a charming shop. But he seemed unsettled. He mentioned a missing vial of arsenic." Craddock's brow furrowed. "Did he now?" "He told me the same, but his records are meticulous. No sign of a break-in. If it was stolen, it was by someone who knew his habits." He paused, flipping open his notebook. "He claims he delivered Fleur Morte to Beatrice 2 days ago, sealed and perfect. Clara Wren, the assistant, confirmed it arrived unopened, but that doesn't rule out tampering later." Miss Marple nodded, her fingers tracing the rim of her teacup. "A sealed bottle," she murmured, "is only as secure as the hands that touch it. And Monsieur Dubois, I think, is a man who guards his secrets closely." She did not mention the tremor in his hands or the flicker in his eyes. Craddock would see such things in time, but she preferred to let her observations ripen. As Craddock left to continue his inquiries, Miss Marple lingered, her gaze drifting to the tea-room's window. Across the street, Dubois emerged from his shop, locking the door with a quick, nervous glance around. He hurried toward the post office, a small parcel under his arm. "Miss." Marple's lips pursed. A man so meticulous, she thought, did not misplace dangerous substances without reason. Was the missing arsenic a theft, as he claimed, or a convenient fiction? She recalled a parallel from her youth, a village apothecary, proud of his potions, who had lost a bottle of laudanum only to have it reappear in a tragic accident. Pride, she knew, could blind a man to his own flaws, or it could drive him to cover them with desperate acts. Dubois's devotion to his art was clear, but art, like perfume, could conceal a bitter truth beneath its beauty. Miss Marple finished her tea and stepped into the crisp afternoon. The village was settling into its routine, but the air held a tension, a whisper of unease. She passed the church, where the vicar was tending his roses, and offered a polite nod. Her mind, however, was elsewhere, sifting through the notes of this mystery. Dubois's pride, his missing arsenic, his visit to Lavender Cottage, they were threads in a tapestry yet to be woven. She would watch him as she watched all the players. For the truth, like a scent, would reveal itself in time. Chapter 4. The Assistant's Shadow. The soft drizzle of an autumn afternoon draped St. Mary Mead in a silver veil, muting the clatter of the village's daily rhythms. Miss Jane Marple, her umbrella tilted against the rain, made her way to Lavender Cottage under the pretense of offering condolences to Clara Wren, Beatrice Ashford's assistant. Her real purpose, however, was to study the young woman who had lived in the socialite's shadow, a figure whose quiet presence might conceal a louder truth. Miss Marple's steps were measured, her eyes keen beneath her bonnet, for she knew that those who served often saw and felt more than they revealed. Lavender Cottage stood at the edge of the village, its whitewashed walls glistening under the rain, its namesake hedges drooping with moisture. The gate creaked as Miss Marple entered, noting the well-tended garden and the drawn curtains of the upstairs windows. She knocked, and after a moment, Clara Wren opened the door, her pale face framed by a plain gray dress. Her eyes, red-rimmed and wary, widened slightly at the sight of Miss Marple. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "How kind of you to come." "I couldn't help but think of you, my dear," Miss Marple said, her tone warm but probing. "Such a shock, losing Lady Ashford so suddenly. You must be quite shaken." She stepped inside, her umbrella dripping onto the mat, and glanced around the hall. The air held a faint trace of fleur morte, a ghostly reminder of its late mistress. Clara led her to the drawing-room, where a fire crackled feebly in the grate. The room, once vibrant with Beatrice's presence, her silk cushions, her crystal vases, now felt hollow, as if the life had drained from it with her death. Clara gestured to a chair, her movements jerky, and offered tea. "I'm managing," she said, her voice tight. "It's just so sudden. I still expect her to call for me." Miss Marple settled into the chair, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "You were with her for some time, weren't you? Such a responsibility, managing her affairs. She must have relied on you greatly." Her words were gentle, but her eyes missed nothing. Clara's bitten nails, the faint tremor in her hands as she poured tea, the way she avoided the mirror above the mantel. "3 years," Clara said, setting the teapot down with a clink. "I handled her letters, her wardrobe, her appointments. She was particular." A shadow crossed her face, and she busied herself with the sugar bowl, as if to hide it. Miss Marple sipped her tea, noting its bitterness. Too long steeped, a sign of distraction. "Particular," she echoed. "That can be trying, I imagine. My niece's friend, Miss Carter, once worked for a lady like that. Always demanding, never a kind word. It wore on her terribly." She paused, watching Clara's reaction. Clara's lips tightened, and for a moment her gray eyes met Miss Marple's, a flicker of something, anger perhaps, passing through them. "Lady Ashford could be difficult," she admitted, her voice low. "She'd scold me over nothing, a crease in her dress, a late letter. Once she docked my wages for a broken vase I didn't even touch." She stopped abruptly, her cheeks flushing, as if regretting her candor. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, her expression one of kindly concern. "That must have been hard, my dear, to give so much and receive so little." She let the words hang, observing how Clara's fingers twisted in her lap, her gaze dropping to the floor. Resentment, Miss Marple knew, could simmer beneath the surface, like a pot left too long on the fire. The conversation turned to the day of Beatrice's death. Clara recounted how she had fetched fleur morte from Marcel Dubois' shop 2 days prior, delivering it to Beatrice's dressing room. "It was sealed," she insisted, her voice firm. "I placed it on her vanity myself. She was so pleased. She loved that perfume." Her eyes darted to the staircase, as if picturing the scene. Miss Marple followed her gaze, her mind picturing the crystal flacon, its golden stopper glinting. "And no one else handled it?" she asked, her tone casual. "It's such a delicate thing, a perfume bottle, easily tampered with, perhaps." Clara shook her head too quickly. "No one. Just me and Lady Ashford, and Ellen, the maid, but she only cleaned." Her voice wavered, and she stood, smoothing her dress. "Would you like more tea, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple declined, rising to examine a photograph on the mantel, a portrait of Beatrice, radiant in a ball gown, her smile triumphant. Beside it was a smaller frame, barely noticeable, showing Clara and Beatrice as young girls, their arms linked, their faces carefree. "How charming," Miss Marple said, touching the frame. "You knew her long ago, didn't you?" Clara hesitated, her fingers brushing the photograph. "We grew up together in a way. Our families were neighbors in Kent, but she changed. After London." Her voice was soft, tinged with something like regret. Miss Marple nodded, filing away the detail. Old ties, she knew, could bind or chafe. She thanked Clara for the tea and stepped back into the rain, her umbrella snapping open. As she walked, she considered Clara's demeanor, the nervous gestures, the quick denials, the shadow of bitterness. Clara had opportunity, handling the perfume, and motive born of years of slights. Yet her fear seemed genuine, as if she dreaded more than discovery. At the village shop, Miss Marple paused to buy a packet of pins, her ears attuned to the gossip swirling around her. Mrs. Clements, the postmaster's wife, was recounting Clara's recent behavior. "She's been jumpy, that one," Mrs. Clements said, wrapping a parcel. "Saw her at the post office, sending letters to London, urgent ones by the look of it. And she wouldn't meet my eye, not like her usual self." Miss Marple murmured her thanks, her mind turning. Letters to London suggested connections beyond St. Mary Mead, debts, perhaps, or secrets. She recalled a housemaid from her youth, quiet and dutiful, who had harbored a grudge against her mistress for years, her resentment erupting in a stolen brooch. Clara's loyalty, she suspected, might have frayed under Beatrice's cruelty, like a seam stretched too thin. As she passed the church, she spotted Inspector Craddock emerging from the vicarage, his coat damp from the rain. He tipped his hat, falling into step beside her. "Miss Marple," he said, "you've been to see Clara Wren, I hear. Find anything out?" "Only that she's a young woman under strain," Miss Marple replied, her tone mild. "She handled the perfume, you know, and she felt Lady Ashford's sharpness keenly. But whether that's enough to kill—" She trailed off, her eyes thoughtful. Craddock nodded, his notebook tucked away. "She's got no alibi for the morning of the death. Says she was sorting papers in the study. But the bottle was on the vanity, and she had access. We're testing for fingerprints, but it's clean so far, save for Beatrice's." Miss Marple's lips pursed. A clean bottle suggested care, calculation. "A young woman like Clara," she said, "might act on impulse, but poison requires planning and courage." She left the thought hanging, knowing Craddock would ponder it. As they parted, Miss Marple glanced back at Lavender Cottage, its windows dark against the rain. Clara Wren, she thought, was a shadow cast by Beatrice's brilliance, but shadows could hide sharp edges. She would watch Clara as she watched the others, for the truth, like a faint scent, would linger until caught. Chapter 5. The Rival's Envy. The drizzle had given way to a crisp, clear evening in St. Mary Mead, the stars pricking through a velvet sky as Miss Jane Marple made her way to the village hall for the annual harvest fete. The event, a flurry of bunting and trestle tables laden with jams and pies, was a highlight of the village calendar, but tonight it carried an undercurrent of tension. Sylvia Vane, the rival socialite whose star had dimmed beside Beatrice Ashford's, was presiding over the fete as its patroness, her presence a magnet for whispers. Miss Marple, her knitting bag tucked under her arm, attended not for the cider or the raffles, but to observe Sylvia, whose envy, she suspected, might hold the key to the tragedy at Lavender Cottage. The hall glowed with lanterns, their light dancing on the polished floor where villagers mingled, their chatter punctuated by laughter and the clink of teacups. Sylvia Vane stood at the center of it all, her blonde hair swept into an elegant chignon, her emerald gown catching every eye. She greeted guests with a practiced smile, her voice bright but her eyes sharp, scanning the crowd as if measuring her audience. Miss Marple, settling into a corner with a cup of tea, noted the effort behind Sylvia's poise, the slight clench of her jaw, the way her fingers tightened around her fan when Beatrice's name was mentioned. Sylvia's rivalry with Beatrice had been the talk of Saint Mary Mead since the socialite's arrival. At the charity gala a week prior held at Sylvia's manor, Beatrice had swept in wearing fleur morte, her auburn hair gleaming, her laughter drawing every gaze. Sylvia, though the hostess, had been overshadowed, her own beauty paling beside Beatrice's radiance. Miss Marple, who had attended the gala as a guest of Mrs. Bantry, recalled Sylvia's brittle smile as Lord Harrowby, a wealthy widower, danced twice with Beatrice, his attention fixed on her. Envy, Miss Marple knew, was a fire that could smolder or blaze, and Sylvia's had been stoked that night. As the fete progressed, Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes following Sylvia as she moved among the tables, pausing to admire a display of prize marrows. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Harmon, joined Miss Marple, her voice low with gossip. "Sylvia's been out of sorts since that gala," she confided. "I heard her tell Mrs. Price that Beatrice was insufferable, her very word. And you know Sylvia's been to India, learned all sorts of things there. Poisons, they say, among them." Miss Marple's expression remained serene, but her mind seized the detail. "India," she murmured, as if merely curious. "How fascinating. Such a place must teach one all manner of skills." She recalled a distant cousin who had served in the colonies, returning with tales of apothecaries who mixed remedies and poisons with equal care. Sylvia's travels, she thought, might have armed her with knowledge as dangerous as her ambition. She rose, strolling toward a table where Sylvia was judging a baking contest, her laughter a touch too loud. Miss Marple paused to admire a sponge cake, her voice gentle as she addressed Sylvia. "Such a lovely evening, Miss Vane. You've outdone yourself, though it must be tiring, organizing all this after your splendid gala." Sylvia's smile tightened, her blue eyes narrowing slightly. "Oh, the gala was nothing," she said, waving her fan. "A trifle compared to Beatrice's theatrics. She did love to steal the show." Her tone was light, but a barb lay beneath it, sharp as a thorn. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes soft but watchful. "She was quite captivating, wasn't she? That perfume of hers, fleur morte, it seemed to enchant everyone. Such a pity it ended so tragically." She watched Sylvia closely, noting the flicker of her fan, the brief tightening of her lips. "Tragic, yes," Sylvia said, her voice cool. "But vulgar, don't you think? Poison in a perfume bottle. So melodramatic." She turned away, as if dismissing the topic, but Miss Marple caught the strain in her posture, the way her shoulders stiffened. As the fete wound down, Miss Marple lingered, her thoughts turning to the gala. Witnesses had described Sylvia's fury when Beatrice dominated the evening, her fleur morte scent trailing her like a spell. A footman, overheard at the Blue Boar Inn, had mentioned Sylvia's sharp words to Beatrice in the garden, words lost to the night but laced with venom. Miss Marple, who had seen Sylvia's glance at Lord Harrowby, suspected the rivalry ran deeper than social standing. Love, or the loss of it, could drive a woman to extremes. She recalled a village seamstress from her youth, jilted by a suitor who favored a prettier rival. The seamstress had never raised a hand, but her bitterness had spilled into cruel gossip, unraveling her rival's reputation. Sylvia, Miss Marple thought, had the means and the motive, access to Beatrice's world, knowledge of poisons, and a heart stung by rejection. But had she the nerve to act? Inspector Craddock's arrival at the fete provided a chance to test her observations. He approached, his face weary but alert, and tipped his hat. "Miss Marple," he said, "you're everywhere, aren't you?" "Keeping an eye on Miss Vane, I suppose." "Merely enjoying the fete," she replied, her tone mild. "Though Miss Vane does seem preoccupied. She spoke of the gala, you know, and Beatrice's flair for attention. It must have been galling to be outshone in her own home." Craddock's eyes narrowed. "We've heard as much. A maid at Sylvia's manor says she saw her near Beatrice's cottage a few days before the death. Something about borrowing a shawl. Convenient, if you ask me." He paused, glancing at Sylvia, who was now laughing with the vicar. "She claims she was home the morning Beatrice died, but her housekeeper's vague on the timings." Miss Marple's lips pursed. "A shawl," she murmured. Such a small excuse for a visit, and yet it placed her near that perfume bottle. She left the thought dangling, knowing Craddock would follow it. Sylvia's visit to Lavender Cottage suggested opportunity, and her knowledge of poisons, gleaned from distant travels, hinted at means. Envy, Miss Marple knew, could supply the motive, like a spark to kindling. As the hall emptied, Miss Marple stepped into the cool night, the stars now bright above St. Mary Mead. Sylvia's laughter echoed behind her, but it rang hollow, like a cracked bell. Miss Marple adjusted her shawl, her mind weaving the threads of the case. Sylvia Vane, with her beauty and her bitterness, was a figure to watch. The truth, like the scent of fleur morte, was elusive but persistent, and Miss Marple would follow its trail with her quiet, unyielding patience. Chapter 6. The Friends Return. The morning sun broke through the clouds over St. Mary Mead, casting a soft glow on the village's thatched roofs and dew-kissed gardens. Miss Jane Marple, seated at her breakfast table with a pot of Earl Grey, gazed out her window, her thoughts on Evelyn Holt, the childhood friend of Beatrice Ashford, whose recent return from Paris had stirred ripples in the village. Evelyn's quiet elegance and reserved manner intrigued Miss Marple, for she knew that old friendships, like old wine, could turn bitter with time. Today, she resolved to call on Evelyn at the Blue Boar Inn, where she was staying, under the guise of inquiring about a parish charity. Her real aim was to uncover the shadows beneath Evelyn's polished surface. The inn, a sturdy building with ivy-clad walls, bustled with morning activity as Miss Marple arrived. The landlord, Mr. Gibbs, greeted her with a nod, his apron stained from polishing glasses. "Miss Holt's in the parlor," he said, gesturing to a door off the tap room. "Quiet lady, keeps to herself. Been here a month, but you'd hardly know it." His tone held a hint of curiosity, and Miss Marple noted it, filing it away as she thanked him and stepped into the parlor. Evelyn Holt sat by a window, a book open in her lap, though her eyes were fixed on the garden beyond. She was a striking woman, her dark hair coiled neatly, her tailored navy dress accentuating her poised figure. At Miss Marple's entrance, she rose, her smile warm but guarded. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice low and cultured, How kind of you to visit. I've heard you're quite the pillar of the village." "Oh, hardly that," Miss Marple replied, settling into a chair with a disarming smile. "I merely like to keep busy with parish matters. I thought you might be interested in our charity drive. Blankets for the orphanage, you know. But I confess, I'm also curious about you, my dear. You've been away so long, and to return just before such a tragedy." She let her words trail off, her eyes gentle but probing. Evelyn's smile faltered, her fingers tightening on her book. "Yes, Beatrice's death was a shock," she said, her tone measured. "We were close once, as girls in Kent, but time changes things. Paris, you see, kept me occupied." She paused, as if choosing her words. "I dined with her the night before she died. She was her usual self, full of charm and plans." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of kindly interest. How lovely to reconnect after so many years, though it must have been bittersweet, with old memories stirred. My friend's niece, you know, once met a childhood companion after a decade and found the past wasn't quite as rosy as she'd thought. Her voice was soft, but her eyes watched Evelyn closely, noting the faint flush on her cheeks. Evelyn set her book aside, her hands smoothing her skirt. "Beatrice and I had our differences," she admitted. "She borrowed money from me years ago, before I left for Paris. Never repaid it, though I didn't press her. She was always so careless with others' feelings." Her voice held a trace of bitterness, quickly masked by a smile. "But that's all past. I was glad to see her again." Miss Marple sipped the tea Mr. Gibbs brought, her mind turning over Evelyn's words. A debt, however old, could rankle, especially if pride was involved. She recalled a village grocer who had nursed a grudge over a trifling sum, his resentment poisoning his goodwill. "And Paris," she said, changing tack. "It must have been fascinating." "I hear you studied there. Chemistry, was it?" Evelyn's eyes flickered, a momentary wariness crossing her face. "Yes, chemistry," she said. "I've always been drawn to science, its precision, its possibilities. But I'm no expert, just a dabbler." She laughed, a light sound that didn't reach her eyes. Miss Marple smiled, her needles clicking faintly as she drew them from her bag. "How clever of you. Chemistry is such a complex field. I suppose one learns about all sorts of substances, poisons even." Her tone was innocent, but she watched Evelyn's reaction, noting the slight stiffening of her posture. "Poisons?" Evelyn said, her voice steady but her fingers twitching. "Only in theory, Miss Marple. My studies were more academic." She rose as if to signal the end of the conversation and moved to a table where a small stack of letters waited. "I must post these, I'm afraid. Paris keeps me busy, even from here." Miss Marple rose as well, her eyes catching the topmost letter, addressed to a chemist's firm in Paris. "Of course, my dear," she said. "I shan't keep you, but do consider the charity drive." As she left the parlor, she noted Evelyn's unsteady hands as she gathered the letters, her composure fraying at the edges. Outside, the village hummed with its usual rhythm, but Miss Marple's thoughts were elsewhere. Evelyn's return, timed so closely to Beatrice's death, was no coincidence, she suspected. The debt, the chemistry studies, the dinner, the night before, each was a thread in a tightening web. She recalled a conversation at the post office where Mr. Clements had mentioned Evelyn's frequent parcels to Paris, sent with urgency. What, Miss Marple wondered, required such haste? As she passed the church, she spotted Inspector Craddock, his coat flapping as he strode toward the inn. He paused, tipping his hat. "Miss Marple," he said, "you've been to see Miss Holt, I take it? Any impressions?" "Only that she's a woman with a past," Miss Marple replied, her tone mild. "Old friendships can carry old wounds, Inspector, and her studies in Paris, chemistry, you know, might bear looking into." She smiled, leaving the suggestion to take root. Craddock nodded, his notebook appearing in his hand. "We've checked her alibi. She says she was at the inn the morning Beatrice died, but Gibbs says she stepped out for an hour, on a walk. Conveniently vague. And we found a receipt in her room for a chemical supply order from Paris, dated last month." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "How interesting," she said. "A woman with knowledge and opportunity, though whether she had the heart to act—" She let the thought hang, knowing Craddock would pursue it. As she walked home, the village settling into dusk, Miss Marple considered Evelyn Holt. Her calm facade, her guarded words, her scientific mind. They painted a picture of a woman capable of precision, perhaps even calculation. Friendship, Miss Marple knew, could be a mask for deeper grudges, like a floral note hiding a bitter undertone. She would watch Evelyn as she watched the others, for the truth, like a scent, would linger until revealed. Chapter 7. The Bottle's Secret. The late morning light filtered through the leaded windows of St. Mary Mead's police station, a modest building tucked behind the village green. Miss Jane Marple, invited by Inspector Craddock to discuss the case over a cup of tea, sat primly in a wooden chair, her knitting bag at her feet. The station's small office, with its cluttered desk and faint smell of ink, was a far cry from the elegance of Lavender Cottage, but it was here that the threads of Beatrice Ashford's death were being woven into clarity. Miss Marple's eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, followed Craddock as he paced, his notebook open to a page dense with notes. "The perfume bottle," Craddock said, pausing to tap his pencil against the desk. "It's the heart of this, Miss Marple. No fingerprints but Beatrice's, no signs of tampering, at least not to the naked eye. Yet Dr. Haydock's certain the arsenic was applied somehow, absorbed through her skin." He frowned, his brow creasing. "It's clever, damnably clever. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were about?" Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of quiet sympathy, though her mind was alight with possibilities. "A perfume bottle," she murmured, "is such an intimate thing. Inspector, it's handled daily, trusted implicitly. To turn it into a weapon requires not just cunning, but familiarity with the victim's habits." She paused, her fingers brushing the edge of her shawl. "Have you considered the stopper, perhaps? It's so small, so easily overlooked." Craddock's eyes narrowed, and he jotted a note. "The stopper? We've focused on the bottle itself, but you're right. It's worth a look. The lab's still testing, but they've found no residue in the perfume itself. If the poison was on the stopper—" He trailed off, his mind catching up to hers. Miss Marple smiled faintly, her thoughts drifting to a long-ago incident in her village where a housekeeper had tampered with a medicine bottle's cork, tainting it with belladonna. The method had been subtle, almost invisible, much like the crime at hand. "A stopper," she said, "is touched each time the perfume is applied. A drop of poison, carefully placed, could blend with the scent's oils, unnoticed until too late." Craddock dispatched a constable to retrieve the bottle from evidence, and while they waited, he shared the latest findings. "We've confirmed the arsenic was pure, not a compound, unusual for a perfumer's stock, despite what Dubois claims. and the bottle was sealed when Clara Wren brought it from his shop, according to her and the maid, Ellen. If it was tampered with, it happened after delivery. Miss Marple's lips pursed. After delivery, she echoed, which points to someone close to Beatrice, someone who could enter her dressing room without suspicion. Her mind flickered over the suspects. Marcel Dubois, with his nervous hands and missing vial. Clara Wren, her resentment simmering beneath loyalty. Sylvia Vane, her envy sharp as a blade. Evelyn Holt, her past with Beatrice clouded by old debts. Each had access in their way, but the stopper's role narrowed the field to a deliberate act, not a fleeting impulse. The constable returned, bearing the crystal flacon of fleur morte, its facets catching the light like a prism. Craddock handled it with gloved hands, removing the golden stopper with care. "We'll send this to the lab at once," he said, his voice tinged with urgency. "If you're right, Miss Marple, this could break the case." She peered at the stopper, its delicate design unmarred but faintly cloudy, as if touched by something more than perfume. "It's such a small thing," she said softly. "But small things, Inspector, often hold the greatest secrets." She recalled a village jeweler who had hidden a stolen gem in a ring's setting, overlooked by all but the most patient eye. The stopper, she suspected, was the key to unlocking Beatrice's murder. As Craddock arranged for the lab analysis, Miss Marple stepped outside, the village green stretching before her, its grass damp from the previous day's rain. She paused by the war memorial, her thoughts turning to the mechanics of the crime. Arsenic applied to the stopper would require precision, a steady hand, a knowledge of how Beatrice dabbed her perfume, a moment alone with the bottle. Sylvia's visit to borrow a shawl, Clara's daily duties, Evelyn's dinner, Dubois's delivery. Each offered a window, however narrow, for such an act. She strolled toward the high street, her umbrella tapping the pavement, and found herself passing Perfume d'Étoile. Through the window, she saw Marcel Dubois arranging bottles, his movements jerky, his face pale. Had he known the stopper's secret when he delivered the perfume? Or had someone else, familiar with his shop's contents, seized the opportunity? Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. The missing arsenic vial, she thought, was too convenient a story, but convenience could mask truth as easily as deception. At the post office, she overheard Mrs. Clements, the postmaster's wife, discussing Evelyn Holt's latest parcel to Paris. "Another one," Mrs. Clements said, her voice low. "Chemicals, I'd wager, from the weight of it. She's been sending them weekly since she arrived." Miss Marple's fingers tightened on her umbrella. Evelyn's studies, her access to Beatrice's home. Could she have procured arsenic, disguised as a perfumer's tool? The thought lingered, sharp as the scent of fleur morte. By afternoon, Craddock telephoned Miss Marple's cottage with news. "You were right," he said, his voice crackling with excitement. "The lab found traces of arsenic on the stopper, concentrated, deliberately applied. The perfume itself is clean, but the stopper's the killer. Whoever did this knew exactly how Beatrice used it." Miss Marple set down her knitting, her mind racing. "A clever choice," she said. "The stopper touches the skin with every application, blending poison with scent. It's personal, Inspector. Someone who knew her intimately or watched her closely." She paused, her thoughts circling the suspects. Sylvia's envy, Clara's resentment, Evelyn's grudge, Dubois's pride. Each could fit, but the stopper's precision pointed to a calculated mind, not a passionate outburst. As she hung up, Miss Marple gazed out her window, the village settling into twilight. The bottle's secret had narrowed the mystery, but the truth remained elusive, like a fragrance carried on the wind. She would visit the suspects again, she decided, probing their words, their glances, their silences. For the murderer, like the poison, was hidden in plain sight, and Miss Marple's quiet patience would uncover them in time. Chapter 8. A Village Tea. The sun hung low over St. Mary Mead, painting the village in hues of amber and rose, as Miss Jane Marple prepared for an afternoon tea at Mrs. Price's tea room. The event, ostensibly a fundraiser for the church roof, was her carefully orchestrated chance to observe the four suspects, Marcel Dubois, Clara Wren, Sylvia Vane, and Evelyn Holt, together in one room. Miss Marple, her knitting bag in hand, had suggested the gathering to Mrs. Bantry, knowing that the intimacy of tea and scones could loosen tongues and reveal truths hidden in casual glances. Her demeanor, as ever, was one of mild curiosity, but her mind was as sharp as the needles tucked beside her. The tea room, with its gingham curtains and polished oak tables, buzzed with the chatter of villagers, their voices a soft hum beneath the clink of china. Mrs. Price, her apron crisp, bustled about, ensuring the teapots were filled and the scones warm. Miss Marple arrived early, choosing a corner table with a clear view of the door. She arranged her shawl, her eyes bright behind her spectacles, and waited for the players in this delicate drama to assemble. Marcel Dubois entered first, his wiry frame clad in a tailored coat, his mustache impeccably waxed. He nodded stiffly to Miss Marple, his gaze darting around the room as if seeking an escape. Clara Wren followed, her gray dress blending into the shadows, her hands clasped tightly before her. Sylvia Vane swept in next, her crimson dress a bold contrast to the tea room's muted tones, her smile as polished as the silver teapot. Evelyn Holt was last, her navy suit understated but elegant, her expression calm yet distant. Miss Marple noted their entrances, each revealing a facet of their character. Dubois's unease, Clara's reticence, Sylvia's bravado, Evelyn's reserve. Mrs. Bantry, acting as hostess, ushered the group to a large table near Miss Marple's, her chatter filling the air with forced cheer. "Such a lovely turnout," she said, pouring tea. "And for such a good cause. Miss Marple, you must try the clotted cream. It's divine." Her eyes twinkled with mischief, aware of Miss Marple's true purpose. Miss Marple smiled, her needles clicking softly as she began a row of stitches. "How kind of you all to come," she said, her voice gentle. "It's heartening to see the village come together, despite recent sorrows." She let the word linger, watching the suspects' reactions. Dubois shifted in his seat, his teacup rattling slightly. "A sorrow, yes," he said, his accent sharp. "My fleur morte was meant to bring joy, not this." His fingers brushed his mustache, a nervous gesture Miss Marple had come to recognize. Clara stared into her tea, her face pale. "It's hard to believe she's gone," she murmured, her voice barely audible. Her eyes flicked to Sylvia, then away, as if afraid of being noticed. Sylvia laughed, a bright, brittle sound. Oh, Beatrice would have loved this, being the center of attention even now. Her tone was light, but her fan snapped open, betraying a flicker of tension. Evelyn sipped her tea, her composure unruffled. "She always did have a flair for drama," she said softly, her eyes meeting Miss Marple's for a moment before dropping to her plate. The glance was fleeting but weighted, as if Evelyn sensed the scrutiny. Miss Marple stirred her tea, her movements deliberate. "Such a tragedy, that perfume," she said, her tone conversational. The police say the poison was on the stopper, you know. So precise, so personal. Whoever did it must have known Beatrice's habits well. She paused, her eyes sweeping the table. Dubois's hand froze mid-gesture, his teacup clinking against its saucer. "The stopper?" he said, his voice tight. "Impossible. My work was flawless." His eyes darted to Clara, then away, a shadow crossing his face. Clara's cheeks flushed, her fingers twisting a napkin. "I only placed it on her vanity," she said quickly. "I never touched the stopper. It was sealed when I brought it." Her voice trembled, and she glanced at Sylvia, who raised an eyebrow. Sylvia's fan flicked faster. "How ghastly," she said, her smile thin. "To think someone could be so inventive. It's almost theatrical, don't you think?" Her words were casual, but her eyes were hard, fixed on the table as if avoiding Miss Marple's gaze. Evelyn remained silent, her expression serene, but her fingers tightened around her teaspoon, a small but telling sign. Miss Marple noted it, recalling a village schoolteacher who had betrayed her nerves with a similar gesture, her calm facade hiding a theft. Small things, she knew, spoke volumes. As the tea progressed, Miss Marple steered the conversation to lighter topics, the harvest fete, the vicar's roses, watching how the suspects interacted. Dubois avoided Evelyn's gaze, his responses to her polite inquiries curt. Clara shrank from Sylvia's sharp glances, her shoulders hunching as if expecting a rebuke. Sylvia, in turn, dominated the table, her laughter too loud, her anecdotes pointed, as if asserting her place. Evelyn spoke little, her words measured, but her eyes followed every movement, like a chess player studying the board. A dropped teaspoon broke the rhythm, clattering to the floor as Clara reached for a scone. She flushed, scrambling to retrieve it, and Sylvia's lips curled in a faint, mocking smile. "Clumsy as ever, Clara," she said, her voice sweet but cutting. Clara's eyes flashed with something, anger perhaps, or shame, before she ducked her head. Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind cataloging the exchange. Sylvia's disdain for Clara was palpable, a dynamic that suggested old tensions. Had Clara's resentment, stoked by such slights, found an outlet in the perfume bottle? Or was Sylvia's scorn a distraction, a way to deflect attention from her own motives? Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Evelyn, whose silence was as telling as Sylvia's theatrics. Her composure, she suspected, masked a deeper unrest. As the tea drew to a close, Miss Marple rose, thanking Mrs. Bantry with her usual courtesy. She stepped into the evening air, the village bathed in twilight, its cottages glowing softly. The tea had revealed more than words, gestures, glances, silences that spoke of hidden truths. Dubois's unease, Clara's fear, Sylvia's bravado, Evelyn's restraint. Each was a note in the melody of the crime. The stopper's poison, Miss Marple knew, pointed to a mind both intimate and calculating, and the tea-room's tensions had tightened the web around the suspects. She paused by the church gate, her eyes on the distant silhouette of Lavender Cottage. The truth, like the scent of fleur morte, was close, lingering in the air. She would continue to watch, to listen, for the murderer's mask, however well-crafted, would slip in time. With a final glance at the tea-room's lit windows, Miss Marple turned toward home, her knitting bag swinging gently, her resolve as steady as ever. Chapter 9. The Rival's Slip. The morning air in St. Mary Mead carried a crisp edge, the first hint of winter whispering through the bare branches of the village elms. Miss Jane Marple, wrapped in her warmest shawl, sat in her garden with a cup of tea, her eyes on the distant spire of the church. Her thoughts, however, were fixed on Sylvia Vane, whose sharp words and sharper glances at the tea-room had lingered in her mind. Sylvia's envy, so vividly displayed at the charity gala, made her a figure of interest, and Miss Marple resolved to probe further. An invitation to Sylvia's manor for a morning coffee, arranged through Mrs. Bantry's connections, offered the perfect opportunity. Sylvia's manor, a Georgian pile set amid manicured lawns, loomed grandly at the edge of the village. Its tall windows gleamed as Miss Marple approached, her umbrella tucked under her arm, in case the clouds above made good their threat. A maid ushered her into a drawing-room adorned with gilt mirrors and velvet drapes, where Sylvia awaited, her blonde hair catching the light like a halo. She wore a silk blouse the color of claret, her smile as polished as the room's silver candelabra. "Miss Marple," she said, rising with a graceful sweep. "How delightful! I don't often have such discerning company." "You're too kind," Miss Marple replied, settling into a plush chair, her knitting bag at her side. "Your home is quite splendid. It must have been a triumph to host the gala here." Her tone was warm, but her eyes were alert, noting the faint tightness around Sylvia's mouth at the mention of the gala. Sylvia poured coffee from a silver pot, her movements deliberate. "Oh, the gala was a success, I suppose," she said, her voice light but edged. Though Beatrice, of course, made it her own, she had a knack for that. Her smile was a blade, thin and sharp, and Miss Marple noted the flicker of her fingers on the pot's handle. "Yes, Beatrice was quite the presence," Miss Marple said, accepting a cup. "I recall her at the gala, dazzling in that scent. Fleur morte, wasn't it? Such a tragedy. What happened? The police say the poison was on the stopper, you know. So precise, so deliberate." She paused, her eyes gentle but piercing, watching Sylvia's reaction. Sylvia's cup paused halfway to her lips, her blue eyes narrowing for a fraction of a second. "The stopper?" she said, her tone airy. "How gruesome. I can't imagine anyone being so calculating." She set her cup down, her fan snapping open with a flick of her wrist. Beatrice did have enemies, I suppose. She was never one to tread lightly. Miss Marple sipped her coffee, its bitterness a contrast to her mild demeanor. "Enemies, indeed," she murmured. "I heard you visited her cottage a few days before her death. Something about a shawl?" Her question was soft, almost incidental, but her gaze held Sylvia's, steady as a compass. Sylvia's fan slowed, her smile tightening. "A shawl, yes," she said, her voice smooth but strained. "I needed it for a costume, a little theatrical event. Beatrice was gracious enough to lend it." She laughed, a brittle sound, and rose to adjust a vase of roses, her back to Miss Marple. Miss Marple's needles clicked faintly as she drew them from her bag, her fingers moving with quiet precision. "How kind of her," she said. "Though it's curious, isn't it? A maid mentioned seeing you near the vanity where the perfume was kept." Her tone was conversational, but her words were a probe, testing the cracks in Sylvia's composure. Sylvia turned, her eyes flashing briefly before her smile returned. "Servants do gossip," she said, her voice cool. "I might have admired her trinkets. She had such exquisite taste, but I hardly lingered." Her fan snapped shut, and she sat again, her posture rigid. Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of kindly understanding. "Of course," she said, "though your travels in India must have taught you such fascinating things. I recall my cousin's tales of apothecaries there, mixing remedies and poisons with such skill. Arsenic, for instance, was quite common, wasn't it? Her voice was soft, but her eyes were unrelenting, catching the sudden pallor in Sylvia's cheeks. India was educational, Sylvia said, her voice tight. But poisons? Really, Miss Marple, you do have a vivid imagination. She laughed, but it was a strained sound, and her fingers twisted the edge of her sleeve. Miss Marple smiled, setting her needles aside. "Oh, I'm just a silly old woman, letting my thoughts wander," she said, her tone disarming. "But it's curious, how knowledge can linger, like a scent." She rose, thanking Sylvia for the coffee, and stepped into the hall, her mind cataloging every gesture, every falter. As she left the manor, the clouds parted, casting a pale light over the lawns. Sylvia's slip, the brief crack in her poise, had revealed more than her words. Her visit to Lavender Cottage, her knowledge of poisons, her envy of Beatrice's allure. They were threads in a tightening net. Miss Marple recalled a village dressmaker who had sabotaged a rival's gown, her jealousy masked by smiles until a stray needle betrayed her. Sylvia's fan, her nervous gestures, were needles of their own, pointing to a heart stung by loss. At the village shop, Miss Marple paused to buy a skein of wool, her ears attuned to the gossip. Mrs. Price, arranging jars of jam, whispered of Sylvia's temper after the gala, her sharp words about Beatrice overheard by a footman. "She said Beatrice deserved to fade," Mrs. Price confided. "Chilling, if you ask me." Miss Marple murmured her thanks, her thoughts racing. She recalled Inspector Craddock's mention of Sylvia's vague alibi. Home, but with no one to confirm her presence the morning of the murder. The maid's account of her near the vanity, the arsenic on the stopper, Sylvia's travels, all aligned like stars in a constellation of guilt. Yet Miss Marple knew. The truth required more than alignment. It demanded certainty. As she walked home, the village quiet under the gathering dusk, Miss Marple considered Sylvia's motives. Envy, not just for Beatrice's social triumph, but for the affections of men like Lord Harrowby, could drive a woman to desperation. The stopper's poison, so carefully applied, suggested a mind both vengeful and precise. Sylvia, with her flair for drama, might have seen it as a fitting end, a rival extinguished, her light snuffed out by her own vanity. Miss Marple paused by her gate, her eyes on the darkening sky. Sylvia Vane was a figure of brilliance and bitterness, her slip at the manor a crack in her facade. The truth, like the scent of fleur morte, was drawing closer, and Miss Marple's quiet vigilance would coax it into the light. Chapter 10. The Alibi's Cracks. The morning mist hung low over St. Mary Mead, cloaking the village in a soft gray veil that muffled the clatter of milk cans and the chatter of early risers. Miss Jane Marple, seated at her breakfast table with a pot of tea, gazed out at the shrouded garden, her thoughts on the alibis of the 4 suspects in Beatrice Ashford's murder. Each had claimed their whereabouts the morning of the tragedy, but alibis, she knew, were like old lace, beautiful until held to the light, where their flaws became clear. Today, she intended to unravel those flaws, beginning with a visit to the Blue Boar Inn and a quiet word with its landlord, Mr. Gibbs, whose memory might illuminate Evelyn Holt's movements. Miss Marple donned her coat and hat, her knitting bag tucked under her arm, and set out for the inn. The village was stirring, its lanes alive with the scent of wet earth and chimney smoke. As she passed Lavender Cottage, its windows dark and its garden gate ajar, she paused, noting the ease with which one might slip inside unnoticed. Opportunity, she mused, was often a matter of an unlocked gate, and each suspect had crossed that threshold in their own way. At the Blue Boar, Mr. Gibbs was polishing the bar, his broad face creased with the day's concerns. He greeted Miss Marple with a nod, accustomed to her gentle inquiries. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said, setting aside his cloth. "Come about the Ashford business, I reckon. The whole village is talking of nothing else." "Just a small matter for the parish records," Miss Marple replied, her tone disarming. "Though I did wonder about Miss Holt. She's been staying here, hasn't she? Such a refined lady. But I imagine she keeps you busy." Her eyes twinkled, inviting confidence. Gibbs leaned forward, his voice low. "Quiet as a mouse, that one. But she's not always here when you'd expect. The morning Lady Ashford died, she said she was in her room, reading, but I saw her slip out around 8, said she was off for a walk, gone an hour, maybe more." He shook his head. "Didn't think much of it till the police started asking." Miss Marple's lips pursed, her mind filing away the detail. Evelyn's walk, so vaguely accounted for, placed her near Lavender Cottage at the critical time. "How interesting," she said. "A walk in such chilly weather. She must be fond of the countryside." She thanked Gibbs and stepped outside, her thoughts turning to Evelyn's chemistry studies and her old grudge against Beatrice. An hour's absence was a crack in her alibi, wide enough for suspicion to slip through. Her next stop was the village shop, where she bought a packet of needles and lingered to chat with Mrs. Clements, the postmaster's wife. Clara Wren's movements, she hoped, might yield similar cracks. "Poor Miss Wren," Miss Marple said, her voice sympathetic. "She must be dreadfully shaken, losing her employer so suddenly. I suppose she was busy at the cottage that morning." Mrs. Clements, arranging a display of tinned biscuits, nodded eagerly. "Oh, she was in and out, as always. Said she was sorting papers in the study when it happened. But I saw her near the church at 8:30, looking all flustered. Didn't say where she was going, mind, but it wasn't her usual time for errands." Her tone held a hint of relish, the gossip's delight in a juicy tidbit. Miss Marple murmured her thanks, her mind racing. Clara's claim of being in the study was unconfirmed, and her presence near the church suggested movement, perhaps to or from the cottage's dressing room. The memory of Clara's bitten nails and nervous glances at the tea-room flickered in Miss Marple's thoughts. Resentment, she knew, could drive a quiet soul to bold acts, like a village girl she once knew who had sabotaged a rival's garden out of spite. Marcel Dubois was next on her list. She strolled to Perfume d'Étoile, where the perfumer was arranging vials behind the counter, his face drawn. "Mademoiselle Marple," he said, his accent clipped. "More lavender water?" His attempt at charm fell flat, his eyes shadowed with worry. "Oh, just passing by," Miss Marple said, her tone airy. "Though I did wonder about your morning, the day poor Beatrice died. You were here, I presume, tending to your beautiful creations?" Her question was gentle, but her gaze was steady, catching the twitch of his mustache. Dubois hesitated, his fingers brushing a bottle. "Oui, I was here," he said. "All morning, preparing orders. My assistant, Pierre, can confirm it." But his voice lacked conviction, and Miss Marple noted the absence of Pierre, who was conveniently away in London that day. She smiled, thanking him, and stepped into the street, her thoughts on Dubois' missing arsenic vial. His alibi, like the others, was fragile, untested by a second witness. She recalled a village chemist who had claimed to be in his shop during a theft, only to be undone by a neighbor's casual observation. Dubois' pride, she suspected, might hide a lie as carefully crafted as his perfumes. Sylvia Vane's alibi, as Miss Marple learned from Inspector Craddock later that day, was equally thin. Over tea at the vicarage, Craddock shared his findings, his notebook open on the table. Sylvia claims she was at her manor, overseeing the staff, he said, his brow furrowed. But her housekeeper says she was out for a spell, visiting a friend. No one can say who or where. And that visit to Beatrice's cottage days before, near the Vanity no less, keeps nagging at me. Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking softly. A friend, she murmured. How vague. And yet, Inspector, each of them, Evelyn, Clara, Marcel, Sylvia, had a moment alone with that perfume bottle. The stopper's poison required only a second's work, a fleeting opportunity. Her voice was soft, but her eyes were bright, piecing together the puzzle. Craddock sighed, rubbing his temples. It's the timing that's tricky. The poison was fresh, applied within a day or two, the lab says. Sylvia's visit was 3 days prior. Clara handled the bottle daily. Evelyn dined there the night before, and Dubois delivered it. Any one of them could have done it. Miss Marple's lips pursed. Or none, she said, her tone thoughtful. Alibis are like shadows, Inspector. They shift with the light. But the truth, like a scent, clings to the one who carries it. She recalled a village scandal where a maid's alibi crumbled under the weight of a single witness's memory. The cracks in these alibis, she knew, would lead her closer to the murderer. As she left the vicarage, the mist had lifted, revealing St. Mary Mead in sharp clarity. The cottage's open gate, Evelyn's walk, Clara's flustered errand, Dubois's absent assistant, Sylvia's vague friend. Each was a crack, a flaw in the facade of innocence. Miss Marple adjusted her shawl, her resolve unwavering. The truth was near, and her quiet patience would draw it into the open, like a thread pulled gently from a tangled skein. Chapter 11. The Motive's Heart. The late afternoon sun bathed St. Mary Mead in a golden glow, softening the edges of its cottages and casting long shadows across the lanes. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her parlor with a cup of tea, reflected on the web of clues surrounding Beatrice Ashford's murder. The arsenic-laced stopper, the fragile alibis, the interplay of personalities at the tea room, all pointed to a motive rooted deep in human passion. Sylvia Vane's envy, sharpened by Beatrice's triumph, seemed the strongest thread, and Miss Marple resolved to test it further. An invitation to Sylvia's manor for a private tea, arranged through a mutual acquaintance, offered the chance to probe the heart of her bitterness. Miss Marple arrived at the manor as the clock struck 4, her knitting bag swinging gently at her side. The grand hall, with its marble floor and towering portraits, echoed with Sylvia's cultivated elegance, but Miss Marple's keen eyes noted signs of strain. Dust on a sideboard, a curtain slightly askew. Sylvia greeted her in the conservatory, a glass-walled haven filled with ferns and orchids, her crimson dress a vivid contrast to the greenery. "Miss Marple," she said, her smile bright but brittle. "How charming of you to come. I do so enjoy these quiet chats." "The pleasure is mine," Miss Marple replied, settling into a wicker chair, her demeanor as unassuming as ever. "Your conservatory is delightful. It must be a solace, with all the village's recent troubles." Her tone was gentle, but her eyes were sharp, catching the flicker of Sylvia's fan as she poured tea. Sylvia's laugh was a touch too sharp. "Troubles? Oh, you mean poor Beatrice. Such a dreadful affair. The village won't stop talking about it." She handed Miss Marple a cup, her fingers steady, but her eyes wary, as if sensing the purpose behind the visit. Miss Marple sipped her tea, its floral notes mingling with the conservatory's earthy scent. "Indeed," she said, "it's hard to escape the talk. The police are quite thorough, aren't they? They say the poison was on the stopper of that perfume. Fleur morte. So precise, as if someone knew Beatrice's every gesture." She paused, her needles clicking softly as she drew them from her bag. "You knew her well, didn't you? Her habits, her allure." Sylvia's fan snapped open, its rhythm quickening. "We moved in the same circles," she said, her voice cool. "Beatrice was impossible to ignore. Always the center of attention, always taking what wasn't hers." A bitter edge crept into her tone, and she caught herself, her smile returning like a curtain drawn shut. "But that's just her way. Was her way, I mean." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of kindly interest. "It must have been trying," she said, "to see her shine so brightly, especially at your gala. I recall my niece's friend, a lovely girl, who lost a suitor to a rival's charm. It stung her deeply, though she never admitted it." Her words were soft, but her gaze held Sylvia's, probing for the truth beneath her polish. Sylvia's fan paused, her eyes flashing with something raw. Anger, perhaps, or pain. "Beatrice took everything," she said, her voice low, almost a hiss. "Suitors, spotlight, even Lord Harrowby's attention. She deserved to fade, to—" She stopped, her cheeks paling as she realized her words. "I mean, it was unfair, that's all. I wouldn't." Her voice faltered, and she rose, moving to a potted orchid as if to steady herself. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, her face serene, but her mind racing. Sylvia's outburst, however brief, had laid bare a motive as vivid as her crimson dress. Envy, not just for Beatrice's social triumph, but for the men she captivated, had burned in Sylvia's heart. Miss Marple recalled a village spinster who had poisoned a rival's roses, her jealousy masked by smiles until a careless word betrayed her. Sylvia's slip was a similar confession, unguarded and telling. "You must have felt so overlooked," Miss Marple said gently, her tone almost maternal. "It's hard to see another take what you've worked for. Your gala was splendid, yet Beatrice stole its light. And that shawl you borrowed, such a small thing, but it brought you so close to her world." Her words were a delicate probe, testing the edges of Sylvia's composure. Sylvia turned, her eyes narrowing. "The shawl was nothing," she said, her voice tight. "A trifle. I was in and out of her cottage in moments. You don't think I'd tamper with her silly perfume?" Her laugh was forced, her fan flicking faster, betraying her nerves. Miss Marple smiled, setting her needles aside. "Of course not," she said, her tone soothing. "I'm just an old woman, letting my thoughts wander, though your time in India must have taught you such clever things. Remedies, perhaps, or other mixtures." She let the suggestion hang, watching Sylvia's face for the telltale signs of guilt. Sylvia's fan snapped shut, her lips thinning. "India was ages ago," she said, her voice sharp. "I learned nothing that would interest the police. Really, Miss Marple, you do have a flair for drama." Her attempt at lightness fell flat, her eyes darting to the door as if longing to escape. Miss Marple rose, thanking Sylvia for the tea with her usual courtesy. As she stepped into the Manners Hall, she noted a photograph on a side table. Sylvia and Lord Harrowby at a hunt ball, her smile radiant, his hand on her arm. The image, so carefully placed, spoke of a hope that Beatrice's presence had crushed. Miss Marple's lips pursed. Love, or the loss of it, could turn envy into something far darker. Outside, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting St. Mary Mead in twilight. Miss Marple walked slowly, her thoughts weaving the threads of the case. Sylvia's outburst, her visit to the cottage, her knowledge of poisons, they formed a pattern, vivid and damning. Yet the others, Clara's resentment, Evelyn's grudge, Dubois' pride, remained in play, their motives tangled like vines. The stopper's poison, applied days before Beatrice's death, pointed to Sylvia's opportunity, but motive alone was not proof. At the village shop, Miss Marple paused to buy a postcard, her ears catching a snippet of gossip from Mrs. Price. "Sylvia was in a state after that gala," she whispered, wrapping the card. "Told a friend Beatrice had it coming. Bold words for a lady." Miss Marple nodded, her mind adding the comment to Sylvia's tally of slips. As she reached her cottage, the village quiet under the gathering dusk, Miss Marple considered the heart of the motive. Sylvia's envy, fueled by lost love and faded glory, had found a target in Beatrice's brilliance. The stopper, tainted with arsenic, was a weapon both subtle and cruel, a fitting choice for a woman who thrived on appearances. Miss Marple adjusted her shawl, her resolve firm. One more step, one final thread, and the truth would unravel, clear as the scent of fleur morte on a still morning. Chapter 12. The Final Note. The village hall of St. Mary Mead glowed softly under the evening's amber light, its rafters festooned with garlands from the recent harvest fete. Miss Jane Marple, seated near the front, her knitting bag at her side, surveyed the small crowd gathered at Inspector Craddock's request. The suspects, Marcel Dubois, Clara Wren, Sylvia Vane, and Evelyn Holt, sat in a tense semicircle, their faces a study in guarded anticipation. The villagers, sensing a resolution to the tragedy that had shaken their quiet lives, whispered among themselves, their eyes darting between the suspects and Miss Marple, whose presence, though unassuming, carried an air of quiet authority. Craddock stood at the center, his notebook tucked away, his expression grave but resolute. "We've gathered you here," he began, his voice carrying over the murmurs, "to lay out the facts of Lady Beatrice Ashford's murder. The arsenic on the stopper of her perfume, fleur morte, was no accident. It was a deliberate act, planned with care. And tonight, with Miss Marple's help, we'll name the guilty." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her eyes moving from face to face. Dubois sat rigid, his mustache twitching, his hands clasped tightly. Clara's gaze was fixed on her lap, her fingers twisting a handkerchief. Sylvia's smile was fixed, her fan still, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of fear. Evelyn, composed as ever, met Miss Marple's gaze briefly, her expression unreadable. The air was thick with expectation, like the moment before a storm breaks. Craddock recounted the evidence. The arsenic, concentrated on the stopper, applied within days of Beatrice's death. The clean bottle, ruling out contamination during its creation. The alibis, each flawed by gaps or missing witnesses. "Someone," he said, "knew Beatrice's habits, how she dabbed, her perfume, how she trusted it. Someone with access, knowledge, and motive." Miss Marple set her knitting aside, rising with a gentle smile. "If I may, Inspector," she said, her voice soft but clear. "This crime, like a perfume, has layers. The top note is opportunity. Each of you could have touched that bottle. The heart note is knowledge. Arsenic, though rare, is not unknown to a perfumer, a chemist, or a traveler. But the bass note, the one that lingers, is motive, and that, I believe, points to one among you." She turned to Dubois, her eyes kind but piercing. "Monsieur Dubois, your pride in Fleur Morte was evident, but so was your unease. Your missing arsenic vial raised questions, yet your records were too precise for such a loss to go unnoticed. You delivered the bottle, but your fear was of scandal, not guilt." Dubois exhaled, his shoulders sagging, relief mingling with his nerves. Miss Marple's gaze shifted to Clara. "Miss Wren, you lived in Beatrice's shadow, enduring her slights. Your resentment was clear, and you handled the bottle daily. But your fear, your trembling hands, spoke of loyalty strained, not broken. You loved her once, as a friend, and that love held you back." Clara's eyes filled with tears, her head bowing as if released from a burden. To Evelyn, Miss Marple said, "Miss Holt, your return stirred old wounds, a debt unpaid, a friendship faded. Your chemistry studies gave you knowledge, and your walk that morning left room for suspicion. But your restraint, your calm, suggested a heart more wounded than vengeful." Evelyn's lips parted, but she said nothing, her eyes steady. Finally, Miss Marple faced Sylvia. "Miss Vane, your envy was the brightest note in this tragedy. Beatrice took your spotlight, your suitors, your place in Lord Harrowby's heart. At the gala, you saw her triumph, and it burned. Your visit to her cottage, under the pretense of a shawl, placed you near the vanity. Your time in India taught you of arsenic's properties, how it could be absorbed through the skin, subtle and deadly. You applied it to the stopper days before, knowing Beatrice's vanity would do the rest." Sylvia's fan fell to her lap, her face paling. "That's absurd," she said, her voice sharp but trembling. "You have no proof, just village gossip and an old woman's fancies." Miss Marple's smile was gentle, but her eyes were unrelenting. "Not fancies, my dear. The maid saw you linger by the vanity. Your alibi for that morning is unconfirmed, and your words, 'She deserved to fade,' betrayed your heart. You wanted Beatrice gone, not just from the stage, but from life, so you could shine again." Sylvia rose, her eyes blazing. "I won't listen to this." But her voice cracked, and as Craddock stepped forward, she sank back, her hands covering her face. "I hated her," she whispered, the words spilling like a confession. "She took everything. Harrowby, my place, my light. I only meant to dim her, just a little. The arsenic was so easy, so quiet." Her voice broke, and the room fell silent, the villagers staring in stunned horror. Craddock signaled to a constable, who led Sylvia away, her crimson dress a fading flame. Miss Marple sat, her needles resuming their rhythm, her face serene but touched with sadness. "Human nature," she said softly to Craddock, "is like a perfume, Inspector. Beautiful, complex, and sometimes deadly." As the crowd dispersed, the village hall emptying into the night, Miss Marple stepped into the cool air, the stars bright above St. Mary Mead. The case was closed, the truth unveiled, but her heart felt the weight of Sylvia's fall. Envy, she knew, was a poison of its own, and Beatrice's death was its bitter fruit. With a final glance at the hall, she walked home, her knitting bag swinging gently, the village quiet once more.